Ever thought of your words as like bullets flying out of a machine gun?
Whoa, that's a pretty intense image.
Yeah, right? Well, that's the idea we're going to dive into today with this piece, God and My Machine Gun.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's this all about?
It's basically exploring, like, how we use our words, and maybe even how we sometimes misuse them.
Oh, I think we've all been there, haven't we? Said something we wish we could take back.
Totally. So this author really makes you think about the impact of your words, comparing them to, well, you guessed it, a machine gun.
I see where this is going. It's like our words can have that kind of force, right?
Exactly. And sometimes we can forget that.
Yeah, I think sometimes we treat our words like they're weightless, but they can leave a mark,
For sure. So let's break down this whole tongue as a machine gun thing, right? What are those bullets he's talking about? Like, what are some real life examples?
Well, he gives some pretty vivid ones. He talks about things like gossip, for instance.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. Spreading rumors and stuff. It's like firing off those little judgments without thinking.
Exactly. And those can really hurt,
Totally. Like shred someone's reputation just with a few words.
Right. Or how about, like, constant criticism? Those little jabs that can chip away at someone's confidence.
Oof, yeah. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts almost. You don't even realize how much it's affecting you until later.
It's true. And even, like, negative self-talk. The stuff we tell ourselves, that can be the most damaging of all.
Oh, for sure. That inner critic can be brutal. So he's saying all those things, the gossip, the criticism, the negative self-talk, those are the bullets coming from our machine guns.
Exactly. And it's scary to think how often we might be firing them off without even realizing it.
Right. It's like we're walking around with these loaded weapons, and sometimes our fingers are just a little too itchy on the trigger.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So if we're all capable of this, like verbal violence, how do we learn to control it?
Well, he actually gets pretty personal about this.
Oh, really? How so?
He admits that he's used his own machine gun to hurt people he loves. Like, he doesn't shy away from his own struggles with this.
Wow, that takes a lot of courage to admit, especially in a piece that's also about faith and spirituality.
Totally. And it's this honesty that makes it so relatable, He's not preaching from some high horse. He's right there in the trenches with us.
Right, admitting that he's messed up too.
Yeah.
So what kind of machine gun mishaps does he talk about?
He talks about struggling with, like, anger outbursts,
Oh, yeah. Those moments when you just lose it.
Exactly. He compares it to bullets spraying everywhere, hitting unintended targets. Like, you're not even aiming anymore. You're just firing blindly.
Yikes. I think we've all been there at some point, haven't we? Maybe not with a literal machine gun, but with our words for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And then he starts to connect these personal experiences to biblical wisdom. Specifically, he brings up James 3:3-8.
Okay, now we're getting into the religious stuff.
Right.
For those of us who aren't super familiar with the Bible, what does that passage say?
Well, it basically compares the tongue to a restless evil full of deadly poison.
Whoa, okay. That's pretty intense. So what's he getting at with this deadly poison idea? Like, what does that look like in real life?
He's talking about the lasting impact of our words. How those hurtful things people say can stay with you for years.
Oh, for sure. It's like some words, they just stick with you, right?
Yeah. And they can really poison your relationships, even your own sense of self-worth.
Yeah, it's true. Sometimes those wounds, they run deeper than any physical scar.
Exactly. And this is where the author's own story gets really powerful. He starts talking about how his machine gun use has impacted his kids.
Oh, wow. So like he's seeing how his own communication patterns are being mirrored by his children.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call for him.
I can imagine. I mean, it makes you think, right? About all those little ears that are always listening, even when we think they're not paying attention.
Totally. He realizes the weight of that, and that's when he starts looking for a different way to communicate.
So he's trying to, like, disarm his machine gun.
Exactly. He calls for a slower trigger finger. Basically, he's saying we need to be more mindful about what we say and how we say it.
Okay, so we've got this machine gun metaphor, the biblical connection, and the author's personal struggles. What's the solution here? How do we actually get better at this whole communication thing?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. He starts talking about the importance of listening, really hearing what the other person is saying before we jump in with our own machine gun response.
Oh, yeah, listening. That's a tough one. I feel like we're all so quick to interrupt or, like, formulate our rebuttal while the other person's still talking.
It's true. We're so focused on getting our own point across that we forget to actually listen and understand where the other person is coming from.
So he's advocating for, like, active listening, really trying to put ourselves in the other person's shoes.
Exactly. And it's not just about hearing the words. It's about paying attention to the tone, the body language, the whole context of the conversation.
I see what you mean. It's like, we need to engage all our senses, not just our ears.
Right. And then, once we've truly listened, we can choose our words carefully.
Okay, so listening first, then thinking before we speak.
Sure.
That sounds good in theory, but how do we do that when we're, like, super emotional, when it feels like our machine gun is about to go off on autopilot?
Well, that's why the author suggests we need a slower trigger finger. Essentially, creating space between the impulse to react and the actual response.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. But easier said than done, right?
Definitely. It takes practice. It's like building a muscle,
So are there any, like, practical tips for developing that slower trigger finger?
He actually points to a verse in the Bible, James 1:9-19, which says, "Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger."
That's a good one. But what does that actually look like in, like, real life?
Well, he talks about the importance of taking a breath before responding, counting to 10, or even just stepping away from the situation for a few minutes if things are getting heated.
Okay, those are some good practical strategies. I can see how that would help to, like, de-escalate that.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just about recognizing when we're not in the right headspace to have a productive conversation. If we're feeling overwhelmed or triggered, it might be better to postpone the conversation until we've had a chance to calm down.
That's so true. I know I've definitely said things I regret when I've been in that kind of state.
We all have. And that's why this idea of a slower trigger finger is so important. It's about taking responsibility for our words and making sure that they're aligned with our values.
So it's not just about avoiding conflict or being a pushover. It's about choosing to respond in a way that's both honest and respectful.
Exactly. And that can be a tough balance to strike, but it's worth striving for.
I think what's really resonating with me is how this author is weaving together his personal experiences, biblical wisdom, and practical advice. It's not just a theoretical exploration of communication. It's a real, raw, and relatable journey.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so powerful. He's not just telling us what to do. He's showing us how he's trying to do it himself, and he's inviting us to join him on that journey.
It's like he's saying, hey, I'm messing up too, but I'm trying to get better, and you can too.
Exactly, and I think that's a message we can all get behind, because let's face it, we all have those moments where we wish we could take back something we said.
Oh, for sure. And I think what's really interesting is how he contrasts his own flawed communication with God's approach.
Right. That's where things get really thought-provoking. He describes God as someone who is always willing to listen, who offers grace and second chances even when we don't deserve them.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially if you've grown up with a more, fire and brimstone image of God.
Totally. It's like he's saying that God has that slower trigger finger perfected. He doesn't react impulsively or lash out with hurtful words. He's patient, understanding, and always ready to forgive.
So it's not about fearing punishment or trying to be perfect. It's about having a relationship with God that's based on love and acceptance.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly freeing, It takes the pressure off of having to be perfect all the time. We can mess up, we can say the wrong thing, and we know that God will still love us.
It makes you think about how we treat each other, right? Like, if God can offer us that kind of unconditional love and forgiveness, shouldn't we try to do the same for the people in our lives?
Now you're getting it. That's the heart of what he's trying to say. He's challenging us to look at our own communication patterns and ask ourselves if they're aligned with the examples set by God.
So it's not just about being a good communicator. It's about reflecting God's love and compassion in the way we interact with others.
Exactly. And that's something that can resonate with anyone, regardless of their religious beliefs.
That's true. I mean, who wouldn't want more patience, understanding, and grace in their relationship?
It's something we all crave, I think. And this idea of mirroring God's communication style gives us a roadmap for how to cultivate those qualities within ourselves.
I love that. So we're not just talking about improving our communication skills. We're talking about personal transformation, about becoming more Christ-like in the way we interact with the world.
Absolutely. And that's where the rubber meets the road. Because it's one thing to talk about these principles, but it's another thing to actually put them into practice.
Okay, so let's talk about the practical side of things. How do we actually become more mindful communicators?
Well, he gives some really concrete examples of the types of bullets we need to be careful about firing.
Oh, I'm curious. Like what?
Well, he talks about gossip, for instance.
Ah, yeah, that's a big one. It's so easy to get caught up in gossip, even when we know it's wrong.
Right. It can seem harmless, just idle chatter, but it can be incredibly destructive. It can damage reputations, create conflict, and spread negativity.
So he's saying that gossip is like a machine gun that we need to learn to disarm.
Exactly. And he challenges us to ask ourselves whether that kind of talk is aligned with the example set by Christ.
So it's about holding ourselves to a higher standard, not just following the crowd or giving in to those temptations to spread rumors or tear others down.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the power of our words and choosing to use them for good.
I think what's so challenging about this whole thing is that it requires a lot of self-awareness. Like, we have to be willing to look at our own communication patterns and see where we're falling short.
Absolutely. It's not always easy to admit that we've been using our machine guns carelessly.
No, it's not. But I think that's the first step, right? Acknowledging the problem.
Exactly. And then we can start to make conscious choices about how we want to communicate differently.
So it's about progress, not perfection. We're all going to mess up sometimes. But the important thing is to keep learning and growing.
You got it. And that's what makes this whole journey so exciting. It's not about reaching some final destination. It's about the constant evolution of ourselves as communicators.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about listening, choosing our words carefully, avoiding gossip. What else does he suggest?
Well, he also talks about the importance of being assertive without being aggressive.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Because I think sometimes people confuse assertiveness with, like, being mean or confrontational.
Right. But it doesn't have to be that way. Assertiveness is about standing up for yourself and expressing your needs and boundaries in a clear and respectful way. It's about owning your truth without trying to bulldoze over others.
So it's about finding that balance between being true to yourself and being considerate of others.
Exactly. And it takes practice to find that sweet spot, but it's definitely possible.
I think what's really helpful is that he gives specific examples of how to be assertive in different situations. Like, he talks about how to say no without feeling guilty, how to give constructive criticism without being hurtful, and how to express your feelings without attacking the other person.
Right. He provides these real-life scenarios that we can all relate to.
I'm starting to see how this machine gun analogy can actually be really empowering. Like, instead of seeing our words as these dangerous weapons that we need to be afraid of, we can learn to use them strategically and effectively to create positive change in our lives and in the world.
Exactly. It's about mastering our machine guns so that we can use them to build bridges instead of burning them down.
I love that image. Okay, but before we get too carried away with all this positive talk, I have to ask, what about those times when anger is justified?
That's a great question. Because sometimes anger is a valid emotion, right? It can motivate us to stand up for what's right, to protect ourselves or others, to fight for justice.
Yeah, I think sometimes people, especially women, are told to suppress their anger, to just be nice all the time. But I think it's important to acknowledge that anger can be a powerful force for good.
I agree with you, and I think what the author is advocating for is not the suppression of anger, but rather the mindful expression of it.
Okay, so it's not about denying our anger, but about channeling it in a way that is constructive rather than destructive.
You got it. And that goes back to the idea of the slower trigger finger. Even when we're angry, we can pause, take a breath, and choose a response that is aligned with our values.
So even in those heated moments, we have a choice. We can react impulsively and let our machine guns fire off randomly, or we could take a step back and choose to respond in a way that is both authentic and respectful.
Exactly. And that's a powerful realization. It means that we're not victims of our emotions. We have the power to choose how we respond, even in the most challenging situations.
That's so empowering. And it brings us back to the idea of personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
We're responsible for our words, even when we're angry.
Absolutely. And that's a big responsibility, but it's also a privilege because it means that we have the power to create positive change with our words.
I think that's a great place to leave things for now. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the destructive power of our words to the transformative potential of mindful communication.
And we've explored how these principles can be applied not just in our everyday conversations, but also in our relationship with God.
Yeah, it's been a really rich and insightful discussion. But before we go, is there anything else you want to add?
Just that this is an ongoing journey for all of us. None of us are going to be perfect communicators all the time. We're all going to mess up, say the wrong thing, fire off a few bullets we wish we could take back. But the important thing is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to use our words for good.
I love that. It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And I think that's a really hopeful message. It means that we all have the potential to become more mindful communicators, to tame our machine guns, and to use our words to create a more positive and compassionate world. So where do we go from here? How do we take all of this idea of the tongue as a weapon and actually, make it practical in our lives?
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question, right? It's one thing to talk about mindful communication, but how do we actually put it into practice, especially when things get heated?
Well, he talks about this idea of like building a safe house for our tongues.
A safe house. What does he mean by that?
He's using it as a metaphor for creating a space, whether it's mental or physical, where we can step back from those machine gun moments and really examine what's going on.
Oh, okay, I get it. It's like hitting the pause button before we say something we might regret.
Exactly. It's about giving ourselves time to cool down, to process our emotions, to think about what we really want to say and how we want to say it.
So instead of just reacting impulsively, we're choosing to respond intentionally.
Exactly. And that intentionality is key. It's about shifting from a reactive mode to a proactive mode.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually create this safe house? Like, what are some practical steps we could take?
Well, she suggests things like taking a few deep breaths before responding, removing yourself from the situation if possible, maybe going for a walk or just stepping into another room.
Yeah, I can see how that would help to break the tension and give you some perspective.
Right. And it can be as simple as counting to 10 in your head before you speak. It's about interrupting that automatic fight or flight response that can trigger those machine gun moments.
It's like creating a little buffer zone, giving ourselves that space to think before we speak.
Exactly. And in that space, we can ask ourselves those crucial questions. What's really going on here? What am I feeling? What does the other person need? What's the most loving and compassionate way to respond?
Wow, those are powerful questions. But I have to admit, it's hard to remember to ask them in the heat of the moment.
It is. It takes practice. It's like training a muscle. The more we do it, the easier it becomes. And eventually, it becomes more of a habit, a way of being.
So we're retraining our machine guns to fire off kindness and compassion instead of anger and judgment.
Exactly. And that's a pretty radical transformation, wouldn't you say?
It is. It's like we're rewriting our internal programming.
In a way, yes. And that's a journey worth taking. Because when we learn to master our tongues, we not only transform our relationships, but also our own inner world.
It's like the old saying, change your thoughts, change your world.
Exactly. And our words are a reflection of our thoughts. So by changing the way we speak, we can actually change the way we think and feel.
That's so powerful. So it's not just about communication. It's about personal growth and spiritual transformation.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. It's not just about fixing our communication problems. It's about becoming better human beings, more aligned with our highest values.
And that's something we can all aspire to, right? Regardless of our religious beliefs or backgrounds, we can all benefit from becoming more mindful communicators.
Couldn't agree more. And it starts with that simple but profound commitment to awareness, to paying attention to our words and their impact on ourselves and others.
It's like we're all carrying these powerful machine guns, and it's up to us to decide whether we're going to use them to build or destroy.
What a powerful image to end on. I think that sums it up perfectly.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey exploring the power of words and the transformative potential of mindful communication.
It really has.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. And remember, your tongue is a powerful weapon. Use it wisely.
And may your words always be a force for good in the world.